Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar, When Risks Compete, Making Infection Prevention Decisions More Transparent and Defensible. My name is Lena Pompakti. I'm the marketing manager here at Metrex. I'll be running us through a little housekeeping before we get started. Continuing education credits are available for this webinar, and they could be attained upon completion of the survey at the end of the presentation. We'll go over that a little bit later at the end of the presentation. As you may notice on your screen, you are able to send us some questions, and we'll try to get to them at the end of the presentation. If we don't get to all the questions, we'll compile them into some show notes and send them within a couple weeks or so. You also have the ability to send us some reactions. Let us know if any points in the topic resonates with you. And lastly, before I give a warm introduction to Diane, a PDF version of the deck will be available after the presentation as well. Next slide. Perfect. So Diane Cullen is a clinical and regulatory leader with more than 20 years of experience in infection prevention, accreditation, standard interpretation, and healthcare operations. Prior to joining Metrex as the clinical development manager, Diane has served in leadership and surveyor roles at the Joint Commission and as an accreditation advisor with Vizient, helping healthcare organizations navigate regulatory compliance and accreditation requirements. Diane's clinical background includes extensive infection prevention and control leadership across diverse healthcare settings. A nationally recognized speaker, she is known for translating complex regulatory and infection prevention concepts into practical strategies that improve patient safety, compliance, and operational performance. With my pleasure, I will welcome Diane. And then next slide. These are her speaker disclosures. I won't read them all out there for you, but these are her disclosures. And then I will welcome her to start her presentation.
Good morning, APIC. Thank you for joining me today. Before we get started, I'd like you to think about the decisions you make every day. Some decisions are easy, some decisions have a clear answer, and some decisions don't. Infection prevention decisions are really no different. Sometimes the issue is an unclear IFU. Sometimes it's deciding between competing products. Sometimes it's responding to an emerging pathogen. Sometimes it's balancing patient safety, workflow, resources, regulatory expectations, and operational realities. And that's really what this presentation is about. Not about how to eliminate risk, not how to guarantee everyone will agree with your decision, and certainly not how to create a right answer when one may not exist. This presentation is about providing a structured way to work through a difficult decision when there may not be one obvious answer, a way to make risks, benefits, priorities, and rationale visible. So here are our objectives for today. Let me just tell you, this topic is personal for me. I've spent more than 20 years working in infection prevention across multiple healthcare environments. I've also worked at the Joint Commission, both as a surveyor and in standards interpretation group, and also as a regulatory consultant. For years, I have found myself hearing and admittedly sometimes saying the same statement over and over again. You can't risk assess out of IFUs. Now, before I go any further, I want to be clear. There is a lot of truth to that statement. Manufacturer's instructions matter. Regulatory requirements matter. Patient safety matters. But so do clinical effectiveness, staff safety, workflow realities, and resource stewardship. And what I find interesting is that we rarely hear phrases like, you can't risk assess out of patient safety. You can't risk assess out of clinical effectiveness. You can't risk assess out of staff safety. Yet, I suspect everyone on this call has been part of a decision where each one of those considerations mattered enormously. In fact, they're often critical to the decision. That doesn't mean regulatory expectations are unimportant. It means organizations are often balancing multiple legitimate considerations at the same time. And there are absolutely situations where regulatory requirements clearly define the acceptable path forward. And in those situations, the decision may already be clear. But many infection prevention decisions are not that straightforward. Those were the situations which kept catching my attention, not because anyone was questioning the importance of regulatory requirements, but because I kept seeing situations where multiple legitimate considerations needed to be evaluated together. Questions about product selection, workflow challenges, resource constraints, emerging pathogens. And what always struck me was that there was often everyone is very good at identifying those issues, but we're less confident about how to compare the competing considerations that remained. And that's where I felt many organizations continue to struggle. As infection preventionists, we're constantly balancing patient safety, regulatory expectations, effectiveness, staff safety, realities, and resources. Sometimes those considerations align, and sometimes they compete. The challenge is how to move forward when important considerations are pulling us in different directions. And if we're honest, unclear IFUs are just one example. We face these kinds of decisions every day. In many of these situations, there isn't a single obvious path forward. And that's what led me to this topic. Not because I wanted to challenge the importance of IFUs, but because I wanted to better understand how we make difficult decisions when multiple considerations matter. How do we make those decisions more transparent, more structured? The rest of today's presentation is really about understanding that challenge. Because I think once we understand why these decisions are difficult, it becomes easier to understand why a structured approach may be useful to us. So let me ask you a question. How many of you have ever sat in a meeting where everyone agreed the issue was important, but nobody could agree on what to do about it? And that's really the reality of infection prevention. Most of our hardest decisions aren't difficult because we don't care. And they're usually not difficult because there's a lack of expertise in the room. They're difficult because multiple legitimate considerations are pulling us in different directions at the same time. Maybe the manufacturer points us in one direction, resource constraints points us in another. Staff safety introduces another set of concerns. Workflow realities create operational challenges. The most effective option may not be the easiest option. The easiest option may not be the most sustainable option. Leadership may have concerns that nobody else in the room is considering. And here's what makes these discussions so interesting is that nobody is necessarily wrong. In fact, everyone may be making a valid point. The challenge is that they're often advocating for different priorities. So, if all of these considerations are influencing the decision, it shouldn't surprise us that intelligent, experienced people sometimes reach different conclusions. And that's what I really want to talk about next. One of the biggest misconceptions in decision making is the idea that disagreement means somebody is wrong. In my experience, that's usually not the case. More often, disagreement happens because different stakeholders are solving the same problem from different perspectives. And what's important here is that everyone in this diagram you see here has the same ultimate goal. Nobody wakes up in the morning trying to make a bad decision. No one is intentionally prioritizing poor patient outcomes. Everybody is working towards the same objective, but they don't all define best the same way. The infection preventionists may naturally focus on reducing infection risks and maintaining consistency with evidence and guidance. Nursing may focus on what can realistically be implemented at the bedside. Environmental services may focus on whether the process can actually be executed consistently in real world conditions. Supply chain may focus on availability, standardization, and sustainability. Facilities may focus on operational impact and infrastructure constraints. Leadership may focus on organizational risk, patient outcomes, and strategic priorities. In most cases, they're not disagreeing about the goal. They're disagreeing about what factors deserve the greatest emphasis. And I think that's a really important distinction because if disagreements are really disagreements about priorities, then maybe the solution isn't convincing everyone to think the same way. Maybe the solution is to make those priorities visible. And that's where the entire framework begins. It begins with recognizing that intelligent, experienced people can evaluate the same situation and arrive at different conclusions for completely understandable reasons. And that's why a structured risk assessment process can be so valuable. At this point, we've established that infection prevention decisions can become complicated with multiple stakeholders, competing priorities, conflicting constraints, and sometimes a great deal of uncertainty. And when those situations arise, the challenge isn't always identifying the option. The challenge is determining how to move forward when multiple reasonable options remain. And I think that's really what APIC's recent toolkit is so important. One of the things I really appreciate about this guidance is that it acknowledges the reality of infection prevention decision making. It recognizes that not every situation has a simple answer. It recognizes that organizations may encounter challenges that require more than just a straightforward compliance review. Rather than treating problematic IFUs as simple compliance question, it provides organizations with a structured process for evaluating concerns and working through complex situations. And honestly, I have to say thank you, APIC. I think this toolkit fills an important gap and provides a strong foundation for organizations navigating these challenges. APIC has established the groundwork for making these tough decisions. The toolkit acknowledges that when we encounter a problematic IFU or another complex infection prevention challenge, the answer is not to jump immediately to a decision. Instead, APIC provides a structured process for working through the problem. We identify the concern, we seek clarification, we review available evidence, and engage the appropriate stakeholders through a multidisciplinary risk assessment. And I think that multidisciplinary risk assessment is incredibly important because this is where the organization begins evaluating the very things that we've been talking about: risks, benefits, constraints, operational realities, and competing considerations. Before we go any further, I think it's worth spending a minute talking about what we mean when we say risk assessment, because it's a term we use frequently in infection control, but we don't always stop to define it. So, at its core, a risk assessment is a structured process for evaluating a situation when multiple factors need to be considered. We consider the potential benefits, the potential risks, the constraints we're working with, the trade offs that may exist, and the uncertainty that often accompanies complex decision. And that last point is important. A risk assessment doesn't eliminate uncertainty, it helps us make decisions despite uncertainty. And that's exactly why risk assessment is such an important part of infection prevention decision making, because many of the decisions we face don't come with a single obvious answer. They involve competing considerations that need to be evaluated thoughtfully and systematically. However, sometimes we've gathered the evidence, we've engaged the stakeholders, we've completed the risk assessment, and we still have multiple options sitting on the table. And that's the situation that I became interested in. What do we do when the risk assessment gives us several reasonable paths forward rather than one obvious answer? And I think that's where many organizations continue to struggle as well. Maybe one option maximizes patient safety, another may be easier to implement consistently. Another may align more closely with regulatory expectations. Another may be more sustainable operationally. And they all may be reasonable, and that's exactly the problem. At this point, the challenge is no longer identifying the risk. The challenge is evaluating how those risks, benefits, constraints, and trade offs should be compared. And this is where I felt there was still a gap. Not a gap in the APIC process described in the toolkit. The APIC process got us here. The gap was in understanding how to transparently compare remaining options once we arrived at a decision point. I suspect many of you have experienced a situation like this, where the meeting is almost over, the evidence has been reviewed, stakeholders have all spoken, the risk assessment has been completed, and yet the room is still asking, okay, so which option should we choose? And this is the moment the framework was designed to address. How do we compare these competing considerations in a way that is transparent, consistent, and defensible? And that's what we're going to talk about next. One structured approach to building a more defensible decision comes from decision science. It's called multi-criteria decision analysis, or MCDA for short. Now, don't worry about the terminology. The concept is much, much simpler than the name suggests. In fact, most of us already do some version of this informally. There are essentially four main steps in this process. First, we identify the factors that matter. Then we determine which of those factors are most important in the specific situation. Next, we compare the available options against those factors. And finally, we document why a particular option was selected. And that's it, just four steps. And as we are about to see, making these steps explicit can improve transparency and defensibility. The purpose of this process is not to guarantee agreement. The purpose of this process is to ensure that the decision is thoughtful, systematic, evidence informed, and explainable. So let's pause for a moment. We just introduced the concept of multi-criteria decision analysis. And if you're hearing words like criteria, priorities, and structured evaluation and thinking, Diane, this sounds complicated. I completely understand. But here's the thing. Organizations are already making decisions using criteria. They may not call them criteria, they may not document them, they may not discuss them explicitly, but they're there. Think about what happens in many committee discussions. Different people may provide different comments, such as, we've always done it this way. Surveyors prefer this. Nursing likes this option. It's cheaper. This is easier. Those aren't just random comments. Those are criteria. They're simply different things that people are considering as they evaluate the decision. The criteria, it already exists. They're just not always visible. And that's where a structured approach is different. Instead of having those considerations buried inside of a conversation, we bring them out into the open. We identify the factors that matter. We discuss them explicitly. We document what was considered, and we make the rationale behind the decision visible. That doesn't necessarily change the decision, but it often changes the quality of the discussion. It makes the process more transparent, more consistent, and ultimately easier to explain and defend. So, if decisions already have criteria, the next logical question becomes, what criteria are commonly influencing infection prevention decisions? So, as I was developing this framework, I started asking a simple question. What are organizations actually discussing during these risk assessments? Not what should they be discussing? What are they actually debating when they're trying to make a difficult decision? Whether a decision involves a problematic IFU or an isolation precaution, a construction project, a new intervention, or an environmental hygiene strategy, the conversation tended to circle around the same themes. People talked about patient safety. They talked about regulatory expectations. They talked about effectiveness. People talked about workflow. They talked about staff safety. And eventually, someone asked, can we actually sustain this? These 6 domains were not selected because a textbook said they should be included. They emerged because they consistently appear in real world discussions among multidisciplinary teams. What struck me was that regardless of the specific issue being discussed, the conversation often returned to the same types of questions. At a high level, these questions sounded like, will patients be protected? Can the decision be defended? Will it actually work? Can staff realistically do it? How does this affect healthcare personnel? Can the organization sustain it? So let's just dig a little deeper into each of these domains. Let's start with the one domain that everyone expects to see, patient safety. This criteria asks a simple question. Which option best protects patients from harm? Sometimes the patient safety is the primary factor driving a decision. Other times, the team may determine that multiple options provide an acceptable level of protection. When that happens, patient safety is still being considered. It just may not be the factor that distinguishes one reasonable option from another. Put simply, patient outcomes remain the ultimate priority. Let's move now to regulatory and manufacturer alignment. This domain asks, how well does the option align with manufacturer's instructions, regulatory expectations, accreditation standards, and professional guidance? These considerations are often at the center of difficult infection prevention discussions. The goal isn't to automatically place regulatory considerations above everything else. The goal is to ensure that they're intentionally considered as part of a thoughtful and defensible decision making process. Now, I do want to acknowledge an important limitation. Not every decision begins with multiple reasonable options. Sometimes the manufacturer's instructions, regulatory requirements, or device classification effectively establishes the acceptable path forward. For example, when we're talking about critical or semi critical devices, organizations are expected to follow validated manufacturer's instructions. In those situations, the discussion is often much narrower because the acceptable path forward has already been defined. So, this framework is not intended to justify ignoring established reprocessing requirements, sterilization requirements, or other situations where patient safety and regulatory expectations have already defined the boundaries of the decision. Where this framework becomes most useful is when multiple reasonable approaches remain. When a team has gathered the evidence, reviewed the requirements, and still has more than one visible path forward. That's when regulatory and manufacturer alignment remains an important consideration, but it becomes one of several considerations the team may need to evaluate alongside of patient safety, clinical effectiveness, workflow feasibility, staff safety, and resource stewardship. Moving on, the next domain, clinical effectiveness, asks a simple question. Will the option achieve the intended infection prevention outcome? Will it work? Because regardless of the cost and convenience or workflow, the intervention ultimately has to work. When evaluating effectiveness, we're looking at the evidence, expected performance, reliability, and consistency of results. Put simply, an acceptable option must be capable of achieving the intended infection prevention goal. Workflow feasibility asks, can staff realistically and consistently implement this approach? We've all seen situations where something looked great on paper, but struggled in practice. Implementation matters. Training matters. Compliance matters. Because even the most effective intervention has limited value if it can't be executed consistently. Ultimately, a perfect solution that can't be followed is not really a practical solution. The domain of staff safety asks, what impact does the option have on healthcare personnel? When we change processes, introduce new precautions, or implement new interventions, those decisions can affect exposure risk, PPE burden, training requirements, and operational safety. Just as we evaluate patient safety, we should also consider the impact on the people expected to perform the work. Protecting patients shouldn't require creating unnecessary risk for our healthcare personnel. And last but not least, our final domain, resource stewardship, asks, can your organization sustain the decision responsibly over time? Yes, true, this is about cost, but it's not about cost alone. It's about availability and staffing and standardization, operational impact, and long term sustainability. Because even highly effective solutions can fail if they can't be maintained. It's important to acknowledge that resources matter because sustainability matters. Now, I don't need everyone to memorize these 6 domains. The point is simply that when infection prevention teams work through difficult decisions, conversations tend to come back to the same type of questions. Is it safe? Does it work? Can we do it? Can we sustain it? These are the considerations we're trying to make visible. Now that we've identified the criteria, an important reality begins to emerge. Those criteria don't always point us towards the same answer. Sometimes they reinforce each other, but sometimes they compete. The option that appears strongest from one perspective may create challenges somewhere else. The option that provides the greatest patient protection may introduce workflow burdens. The option that is easiest to implement may not provide the strongest clinical performance. The option that best supports resource stewardship may create other concerns that need to be addressed. And that's exactly where the decision making becomes difficult because when multiple reasonable options remain, not every consideration will point us towards the same answer. Organizations eventually have to decide which considerations will have the greatest influence on their final decision, and that's where priorities begin to emerge. Prioritization is deciding whether all criteria carry the same influence in each situation. And the honest answer to that question is well, sometimes they do. Sometimes the team looks at the criteria and concludes that no single consideration should carry more influence than any other. In those situations, treating the criteria equally may be entirely appropriate. But other times, the team may conclude that certain considerations should carry greater influence in the decision. Patient safety may rise to the top. Clinical effectiveness may rise to the top. Workflow feasibility may become particularly important. Notice that all of the criteria still exist. All of these considerations still matter. But in this situation, some considerations rise to the top. They receive more attention. They have more influence on the final decision. In other words, they become the primary driver for the decision, not because the other criteria are unimportant, but because these are the criteria most likely to shape the final decision. Prioritization is simply deciding what matters most in this situation. On the previous slide, we talked about prioritization, deciding what matters most in this situation. Making priorities visible simply means finding a way to reflect how much influence each consideration should have on the final decision. Because if we don't make them visible, everyone may leave the meeting with a different understanding of what actually mattered most. Now, I don't want everyone looking at this and getting too caught up in exact numbers. We're not pretending every patient safety always carries a 30% influence and clinical effectiveness carries exactly 20% influence each and every time a decision is being made. The exact numbers matter much less than the conversation that led to those numbers. The percentages are simply one way to represent the influence. They help us communicate which considerations are likely to carry the greatest influence in the final comparison. Think of it this way: we have a finite amount of influence available in any decision. Some decisions may distribute that influence equally, other decisions may place greater influence on particular concerns. Each approach is reasonable. We're not deciding what matters. We are making visible what matters most in this situation. And once we've made those priorities visible, we're ready for the next step in this process, evaluating how well do the available options perform against those priorities. And that's where scoring comes in. Now we've reached the point where we begin comparing options. At this stage, we're not deciding which option is best. We're simply asking, how does each option perform against the criteria that we've established? You'll see our 6 criteria listed here on the left side of this table. Across the top are 3 options we're evaluating. For each criteria, we're assigning a score that reflects how well that option performs. On the left side of the slide is the simplified scoring rubric that we're going to use. A score of 5 means the option aligns strongly with that criteria. A score of 3 suggests trade-offs, limitations, or mixed performance. And a score of 1 indicates a significant concern. The important thing isn't the exact number. The important thing is that every option is being evaluated using the same criteria and the same scoring approach. That consistency allows us to compare options in a structured way. Scoring describes performance. It doesn't determine the decision. In other words, scoring tells us how each option performs. It doesn't tell us which option should choose. Let's look at an example here. We're evaluating those three possible options. We have the current process, which has its strengths in some areas and weaknesses in others. Alternative process one has a different pattern of strengths and weaknesses. And alternative process two looks different again. The scores are simply making those differences visible in each criteria. Before we move into examples, I want to pause here for a second because by now we talked about criteria, we talked about priorities, we talked about weighting, and we talked about scoring. And if you're sitting there thinking this feels like a lot, I totally understand. But when you step back, the process is actually much simpler than it looks. At its core, we're really asking four questions. First, what matters? We identify the factors that influence the decision. We've called those criteria. Second, what matters most? Because identifying the criteria doesn't automatically tell us how to make the decision. And that's where we're prioritizing. Third is how do the available options compare? We evaluate each option and how it performs against those criteria. And that's where the scoring came in. And finally, why do we choose this option? Because the goal isn't simply to make a decision, it's be able to explain the rationale behind it. So when you strip away all the terminology, the weighting, the scoring, the diagrams, the criteria, this is really, really just a structured conversation about a difficult decision. And the question now is, what happens when different people look at the same information? Let's go ahead and find out. So I'd like you all to take a look at these three options. They may look familiar to you. We just saw them in the previous slide. You know that there are three different options, each with different strengths and weaknesses. The numbers haven't changed. And please don't overthink the math. Don't try to calculate anything. Just look at the strengths and weaknesses of each option. And what I want you to do is to tell me which option would you choose? The current process, alternative process one, or alternative process two? I think we have a polling going up. I think we do. Okay. I can't see the results of the polling. Oh, there we go. Thank you. Okay. Whew, thanks. I thought everyone laughed. Okay. So, which option would you choose? All right. So, as people are coming in, I mean, each of these clearly has strengths and weaknesses. We've said already that five is a strength and one is a weakness. And in each of these criteria, we're looking at each one. And I see right now we have quite a few people who have responded. And what we're seeing is what I would expect to see. Uh, Clearly, right now, alternative process one is winning very solidly with 60%, current process at 28%, and alternative process at 12. And you know what? Quite honestly, I've seen this before, and it's very similar. Notice that we don't all arrive at the same conclusion here, and that's okay. Some of us are drawn to the clinical performance of the current process. Others are attracted to the workflow and resource stewardship advantages of alternative one. Others may prefer the regulatory alignment and patient safety advantages offered by alternative two. And I think that is actually the point. We looked at the same information. Many of us arrived at different conclusions, and none of those conclusions were necessarily unreasonable, and certainly none of those conclusions are wrong. The framework isn't trying to force everyone towards the same answer. It's helping us understand what drove the answer. So we're going to get into some examples of the framework now. Before we get into infection prevention examples, we're going to start off with a common decision most of us have or will have to face. Let's talk about finding a place to live. Choosing a place to live can be incredibly complicated. Whether you're renting an apartment, buying your first home, relocating for work, or downsizing later in life. There are incredibly important criteria to consider when making this decision. And just like many infection prevention decisions, there usually is not one perfect option. So, where would we start? Most of us will begin by identifying the things that matter. Maybe affordability matters. Maybe it's location, commute time to work. Maybe it's safety. Maybe school districts are important. Maybe the amount of space in the house is really important. Maybe not having much maintenance is important. Those aren't answers. Those are simply the criteria we're going to use to evaluate our options. Once we've identified what matters, the next question becomes what matters most to me right now? And that question may look very different depending on where you are in life. A young professional starting a career might be willing to sacrifice space for a shorter commute to work and a vibrant location. They may spend very, very little time talking or thinking about school districts. That will definitely be low on their priority list. A growing family, however, may look at the same properties and come to a completely different conclusion. Suddenly, school districts, safety, and space may move to the top of the list. The apartment downtown that seemed perfect 5 years ago may not feel quite so perfect anymore. And then later in life, the conversation may shift again. Perhaps maintenance becomes more important. Maybe accessibility becomes important. Maybe being closer to the family becomes a priority. The houses haven't changed. What changed was the perspective of the decision maker. And as the priorities change, different criteria naturally have a greater influence on the final decision. Now, once we've identified what matters and thought carefully about what matters most in our specific situation, only then do we start comparing the options. How does house A perform, or house B perform, or house C perform? Because evaluating the options before understanding the priority often leads to confusion and maybe making the wrong decision. So, for the purpose of scoring isn't to make the decision for us. It's simply a way of comparing available options consistently against things we've already determined are important. And that's exactly the same process we'll use when we return to our infection prevention decisions. So why do we spend a lot of time talking about housing? Not because I wanted to help anyone buy a house. No. It's because the process we just walked through is remarkably similar to the way many infection prevention decisions unfold. The underlying decision-making process is often very similar. So now we're going to take the same approach and apply it to a couple of infection prevention scenarios. And one particular that we saw earlier in the presentation. And as we're going to see, when priorities change in different situations, decisions can change too. So let's go ahead and take a look. I would like to introduce you to Organization A. This organization is facing increasing operational and financial pressures. The current process works, it supports patient safety, it's clinically effective, it requires a significant resource, and it creates workflow challenges. And leadership is beginning to question whether the process is sustainable over a long time. So, when stakeholders come together to discuss the issue, three primary decision drivers emerge: patient safety, regulatory alignment, and resource stewardship. In other words, this organization wants to improve sustainability and efficiency, but not at the expense of patient safety or regulatory expectations. Now let's compare the options. Remember, we saw exactly these three options earlier in the presentation. You all voted on them. The scores haven't changed. The strengths and weaknesses for each option haven't changed. The question is, which option best aligns with what matters most to this organization? The current process on the left performs very well in patient safety, clinical effectiveness, and regulatory alignment, but it performs poorly in resource stewardship and workflow feasibility. Two of the concerns that led this organization to evaluate alternatives in the first place. Alternative process Two on the far right, I know I'm skipping over one, but I want to look at number two, performs reasonably well across most criteria. It remains strong, maintains a strong regulatory alignment, but it doesn't meaningfully address the organization's resource concerns. Alternative process one in the middle in orange tells a different story. It performs well in patient safety, it performs well in workflow feasibility, and it offers the strongest improvement in resource stewardship. So, when organization applies its priorities, the operational and sustainability benefits are significant enough that alternative process one becomes the preferred option. It's not perfect, that's for sure. In fact, the regulatory alignment concerns remain visible and would need to be clarified, mitigated, and documented before implementation. The organization identified the challenges it was trying to solve. It established the primary drivers for the decision, and those drivers ultimately influence their outcome. Okay, so organization A chose alternative process one. Let's see what another organization facing different circumstances would choose. I'd like to introduce you to Organization B. This organization is facing a different challenge. They are a hospital system that operates across multiple sites and have many outpatient clinics and are struggling with variation in how processes are being implemented. Training consistency has become a concern. Workflow challenges have created opportunities for shortcuts and process variations. And leadership is looking for a solution that can be implemented consistently, supported operationally, and aligned with established expectations. As stakeholders discuss this issue, three primary drivers emerge. Those are regulatory alignment, patient safety, and workflow feasibility. This organization believes that a process is only effective if it can be executed consistently. They want an approach that supports patient safety, aligns with expectations, and works with the reality of daily practices. So when these priorities are applied, the results look very different than Organization A's results. The current process performs very well in patient safety and clinical effectiveness, but it continues to struggle with workflow feasibility, excuse me. And those workflow challenges are part of what brought Organization B to the table in the first place. Alternative process one performs extremely well from a workflow perspective, but it raises concerns from regulatory alignment. And because regulatory alignment is a primary driver for this organization, that limitation has a significant impact on the overall evaluation. Alternative process three provides a different balance. It performs strongly in patient safety, performs strongly in regulatory alignment, and it offers a meaningful workflow improvement compared with the current process. As a result, alternative process two emerges as the preferred option. Notice that alternative process two doesn't necessarily have the highest score in every category, and the risks associated with staff safety should not be ignored. In fact, before moving forward with a selection, the organization should address the staff safety issues. However, when it comes down to it, alternative process two emerges as the preferred option because it best aligns with this organization and what they're trying to solve. So, what happens when an organization decides that no single criteria is greater than any other? We're going to look at a final organization. Unlike our previous example, our next organization, Organization C, doesn't believe that any single criteria should carry more influence than any other. They recognize patient safety, regulatory alignment, clinical effectiveness, workflow feasibility, and staff safety and resource stewardship are all very important. And after discussing among stakeholders, they decide to treat each consideration equally. In other words, there are no primary decision drivers. Every criteria carries the same amount of influence. This is an important decision in and of itself. Equal influence doesn't mean that the organization avoided prioritization. It means that the organization intentionally chose not to elevate one consideration over another. When these priorities are applied, alternative one emerges as the preferred option. not because it's perfect, but because it performs consistently well across most criteria and benefits from those strengths being considered equally. And I think this example highlights an important lesson here. The framework isn't designed to favor a particular outcome. The purpose of the framework is to evaluate options consistently. Sometimes that process supports a new approach. Sometimes it supports a different approach. And sometimes it just validates the process that you're already using. For example, if an organization were experiencing elevated infection rates, caring for a particularly vulnerable population, or placing greater influence on patient safety and clinical effectiveness, it's entirely possible that the current process would emerge as the preferred option. So, when you step back and look at all three organizations, I think a pattern starts emerging. Same options, same evidence, same strengths, same weaknesses, different priorities, and different but explainable decisions. So far, we've been using a fairly simple example, a product evaluation and a resource decision, something many of us probably have encountered before. But one of the reasons I want to introduce this framework is because it extends far beyond products. Infection preventionists face difficult decisions all the time. Emerging pathogens with evolving guidance and limited evidence and conflicting recommendations, and sometimes significant uncertainty happens. I suspect this may feel familiar to many of us. So I want to walk through an example that feels a little closer to the reality of infection prevention, especially in light of our not so distant past experiences. Let's imagine a new pathogen emerges. Here's the situation. The new pathogen emerges. Again, the evidence is limited. Guidance is evolving. The experts don't agree. And organizations, well, y'all still need to make some decisions. And one of the first questions an infection prevention team may face is, what precautions should we implement? Now we're going to look at the options that are available. We could use standard precautions or enhanced precautions or respiratory precautions, airborne precautions, or some type of hybrid approach. And here's the challenge. These are not examples of clearly good options and clearly bad option. Each option has strengths. Each option has limitations. Each option creates different consequences. For example, if evidence is limited, we may place greater emphasis on precaution. If resources are strained, we may consider operational feasibility. If guidance is evolving, we may pay closer attention to regulatory alignment. And that's what I want you to notice. Even though the problems change completely from deciding between two products to deciding between multiple isolation options, the decision process doesn't change. We're evaluating the same 6 domains we've been discussing throughout these presentations, and we're still following the same basic process. We're defining our options, we're evaluating how each option performs, we're determining what matters, we're comparing the results, and then we document the rationale. Let's see what happens when we actually apply the framework to this situation. How do these options compare when we're evaluating them using that same structured approach? So again, we're evaluating each of those options against those same 6 domains. The scores simply describe how each option performs in each of those criteria. For example, airborne isolation scores very well in patient safety, regulatory alignment, and clinical effectiveness, but notice that it doesn't score well in workflow feasibility or resource stewardship. And quite honestly, that makes sense. The stronger the precautions become, the more of an operational burden we can create. And that's exactly why no option is perfect. Now we're going to apply the priorities. In this example, patient safety, regulatory alignment, and clinical effectiveness carry the greatest influence. Those priorities reflect what matters most to this organization at this point in time. And when we combine these priorities with the performance scores, airborne isolation rises to the top. And I think that's what makes this example interesting. The takeaway is not that airborne isolation is always the right answer. The takeaway is that we can clearly see how your organization arrived at this decision. And if you think about it, that's exactly what we've seen throughout today's examples. Different situations, different priorities, different outcomes, but a remarkably similar decision-making process. So let's step back and talk about what the process tells us about defensibility. We've walked through several different decisions. We've looked at deciding where we're going to live. We've looked at product evaluation. We've compared how three organizations could look at the same information and arrive at different conclusions. And we just recently worked through our emergency pathogen scenario. On the surface, those seem like very different situations. But again, when you look closely, they all follow the same pattern. The details of the problems change, priorities change, and the options change, but the decision making process remained consistent. In every example, we started recognizing the issue. We brought together the people who needed to be part of the discussion. We identified what mattered. We made the priorities visible, and we evaluated the options using the same criteria. Ultimately, we documented the rationale behind the decision we came up with. A defensible decision isn't built on one single criteria. Notice that none of these pillars stand alone. All of them matter. It's built by thoughtfully balancing the criteria that matter in that particular situation. And that's why I like this image, because the foundation isn't just one single score. It's evidence, it's stakeholder input, it's a structured risk assessment. And together, those elements support a decision that can be explained and understood. Will everyone agree with that decision? Maybe not. Will every organization arrive at the same conclusion? Probably not. But a defensible process allows people to see how the decision was reached. And that's really the takeaway I hope you remember. A defensible decision isn't perfect. It's transparent, it's structured, it's explainable, and it's documented. And that distinction is important because transparency and defensibility are not the same as immunity from scrutiny. So before we close, I want to come back to the word defensible because I think it's important to be clear about what that does and does not mean. A structured decision-making process does not guarantee that everyone will agree with the outcome. It doesn't guarantee another organization would make the same decision. It doesn't guarantee a surveyor will agree with a decision. And it certainly doesn't eliminate the operational risk. In fact, I'm just going to say this because it's reality. An accrediting organization or regulatory agency may still identify a finding. And depending on the circumstances, that finding may be entirely appropriate. Because the purpose of this framework is not to guarantee compliance and is not to guarantee agreement. The purpose is to ensure that your decision was thoughtful, transparent, and intentionally made based on your priorities. And this is where leadership becomes so important. If an organization decides to move forward with an option that involves trade-off or known risk, that decision should not belong to infection preventionists alone. The stakeholders should understand the risks. Leadership should understand those risks. The rationale needs to be documented, and the decision should be owned by the organization because some risks are accepted deliberately, but they should never be accepted unknowingly. The risk doesn't disappear. The risk here becomes visible. And to me, that is the real value of this product. Not that it guarantees a particular outcome, nor does it guarantee agreement, but it makes that decision-making process visible. It shows everyone what was considered, what evidence was reviewed, who was involved, and what trade-offs were accepted, and why your organization moved forward. So when I talk about defensibility, I'm not talking about finding a perfect answer. There likely is no perfect answer. I'm talking about being able to explain how a reasonable answer was reached. Ultimately, the goal isn't to create a decision that nobody can question. The goal is to create a decision that can clearly be explained, understood, documented, and owned. So I appreciate the opportunity to spend this time with you today. I know many of the decisions we discussed aren't theoretical. They're the kind of decisions infection preventionists, healthcare leaders, and multidisciplinary teams are making every day. My
Great.
hope is that you leave with a framework that helps make those conversations a little easier, a little more transparent, and a little more defensible. Now, if you're exploring those concepts in your own organization, working through a difficult decision, or simply trying to determine whether this approach may be helpful in your setting, I'd be happy to continue the conversation. Please feel free to reach out using the contact information on the screen. I would love to hear how your organization is approaching these challenges, what's working for you, and where this type of framework might be helpful. So, thank you again for your time, your engagement, and most importantly, for the work you do every day to protect patients, support healthcare personnel, and advance infection prevention.